Episode 9. What Father did was, well, it was what they call classified. Top secret, you mean? That's right. And you don't even have any idea what it was about? Meg shook her head. No, not really. Just an idea because of where he was. Well, where? Out in New Mexico for a while. We were with him there. And then he was in Florida at Cape Canaveral, and we were with him there too. And then he was going to be traveling a lot, so we came here. You've always had this house? Yes, but we used to live in it just in the summer. And you don't know where your father was sent? No. At first we got lots of letters. Mother and Father always wrote each other every day. I think Mother still writes him every night. Once in a while, the postmistress makes some kind of a crack about all her letters. I suppose they think she's pursuing him or something, Calvin said, rather bitterly. They can't understand plain ordinary love when they see it. Well, go on. What happened next? Nothing happened, Meg said. That's the trouble. Well, what about your father's letters? They just stopped coming. You haven't heard anything at all? No, Meg said. Nothing. Her voice was heavy with misery. Silence fell between them, as tangible as the dark tree shadows that fell across their laps, and that now seemed to rest upon them as heavily as though they possessed a measurable weight of their own. At last, Calvin spoke in a dry, unemotional voice, not looking at Meg. Do you think he could be dead? Again, Meg leapt up, and again Calvin pulled her down. No! They'd have told us if he were dead. There's always a telegram or something. They always tell you. What do they tell you? Meg choked down a sob, managed to speak over it. Oh, Calvin, Mother's tried and tried to find out. She's been down to Washington and everything, and all they'll say is that he's on a secret and dangerous mission, and she can be very proud of him. But he won't be able to communicate with us for a while, and they'll give us news as soon as they have it. Meg, don't get mad, but do you think maybe they don't know? A slow tear trickled down Meg's cheek. That's what I'm afraid of. Why don't you cry? Calvin asked gently. You're just crazy about your father, aren't you? Go ahead and cry. It'll do you good. Meg's voice came out trembling over tears. I cry too much. I should be like Mother. I should be able to control myself. Your mother is a completely different person, and she's a lot older than you are. I wish I were a different person, Meg said shakily. I hate myself. Calvin reached over and took off her glasses. Then he pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket and wiped her tears. This gesture of tenderness undid her completely, and she put her head down on her knees and sobbed. Calvin sat quietly beside her, every once in a while patting her head. I'm sorry, she sobbed finally. I'm terribly sorry. Now you'll hate me. Oh, Meg, you are a moron, Calvin said. Don't you know you're the nicest thing that's happened to me in a long time? Meg raised her head, and moonlight shone on her tear-stained face. Without the glasses, her eyes were unexpectedly beautiful. If Charles Wallace is a sport, I think I'm a biological mistake. Moonlight flashed against her braces as she spoke. Now she was waiting to be contradicted. But Calvin said, Do you know, this is the first time I've seen you without your glasses? I'm blind as a bat without them. I'm nearsighted like Father. Well, you know what? You've got dreamboat eyes, Calvin said. Listen, you go right on wearing your glasses. I don't think I want anybody else to see what gorgeous eyes you have. Meg smiled with pleasure. She could feel herself blushing, and she wondered if the blush would be visible in the moonlight. Okay, hold it, you two, came a voice out of the shadows. Charles Wallace stepped into the moonlight. I wasn't spying on you, he said quickly, and I hate to break things up, but this is it, kids. This is it. His voice quivered with excitement. This is what? Calvin asked. We're going. Going? Where? Meg reached out and instinctively grabbed for Calvin's hand. I don't know exactly, Charles Wallace said, but I think it's to find Father. Suddenly, two eyes seemed to spring at them out of the darkness. It was the moonlight striking on Mrs. Who's glasses. She was standing next to Charles Wallace, and how she managed to appear where a moment ago there had been nothing but flickering shadows in the moonlight, Meg had no idea. She heard a sound behind her and turned around. There was Mrs. Whatsit scrambling over the wall.
My, but I wish there were no wind,
Mrs. Whatsit said plaintively.
It's so difficult with all these clothes.
She wore her outfit of the night before, rubber boots and all, with the addition of one of Mrs. Buncombe's sheets, which she had draped over her. As she slid off the wall, the sheet caught in a low branch and came off. The felt hat slipped over both eyes, and another branch plucked at the pink stole.
Oh, dear, she sighed. I shall never learn to manage.
Mrs. Who wafted over to her, tiny feet scarcely seeming to touch the ground, the lenses of her glasses glittering. Come te picchi il fallo amaro morso, Dante. What grievous pain a little fault doth give thee. With a claw-like hand, she pushed the hat up on Mrs. Whatsits's forehead, untangled the stole from a tree, and with a deft gesture took the sheet and folded it.
Oh, thank you,
Mrs. Whatsit said.
You're so clever.
Un asno viejo sabe más que un potro. A Perez. An old ass knows more than a young colt.
Just because you're a paltry few million years.
Mrs. Whatsit was starting indignantly when a sharp, strange voice cut in. All right, girls, this is no time for bickering.
It's Mrs. Which,
Charles Wallace said. There was a faint gust of wind. The leaves shivered in it. The patterns of moonlight shifted, and in a circle of silver something shimmered, quivered, and the voice said, I do not think I will materialize completely. I find it very tiring, and we have much to do. Chapter 4. The Black Thing. The trees were lashed into a violent frenzy. Meg screamed and clutched at Calvin, and Mrs. Witch's authoritative voice called out, Quiet, child! Did a shadow fall across the moon? Or did the moon simply go out, extinguished as abruptly and completely as a candle? There was still the sound of leaves, a terrified, terrifying rushing. All light was gone. Darkness was complete. Suddenly the wind was gone, and all sound. Meg felt that Calvin was being torn from her. When she reached for him, her fingers touched nothing. She screamed out, Charles! And whether it was to help him or for him to help her, she did not know. The word was flung back down her throat, and she choked on it. She was completely alone. She had lost the protection of Calvin's hand. Charles was nowhere, either to save or to turn to. She was alone in a fragment of nothingness. No light, no sound, no feeling. Where was her body? She tried to move in her panic, but there was nothing to move. Just as light and sound had vanished, she was gone too. The corporeal Meg simply was not. Then she felt her limbs again. Her legs and arms were tingling faintly as though they had been asleep. She blinked her eyes rapidly, but though she herself was somehow back, nothing else was.